The morning sun cast long shadows across Blackstone Air Base as Rebecca Davis arrived for another day that looked identical to the thousand that had come before. At 5 a.m., the maintenance hangar buzzed with pre-dawn activity. The familiar symphony of tools clanging, engines humming, and boots echoing against concrete floors that had witnessed decades of military precision. Rebecca pulled her auburn hair back into the same regulation bun she'd worn for 8 years, a habit from days when loose strands could spell disaster in a cockpit. Her green eyes, once sharp as morning frost, now avoided contact with those who saw her as nothing more than another wrench-turner in faded coveralls. The transformation had been deliberate, calculated, and absolutely necessary for survival. Her steel-toed boots echoed against the hangar floor as she made her way to her assigned workstation. The other mechanics called her the professor behind her back, a reference to her habit of reading technical manuals during lunch breaks and her uncanny ability to diagnose aircraft problems that stumped senior technicians. What they didn't know was that Rebecca Davis had once been Captain Rebecca Hawthorne, the youngest squadron leader in Air Force history. 10 years ago, she had commanded 6 F-22 Raptors in Operation Desert Shield, leading America's finest pilots into what should have been a routine mission. Instead, it became the nightmare that ended her career and began her exile. The betrayal had come from Colonel Vincent Kruger, her mentor and commanding officer. Intelligence sold to the highest bidder, coordinates leaked to enemy forces, 4 pilots dead in an ambush that never should have happened. When the smoke cleared and the investigations began, falsified evidence painted Rebecca as the reckless commander who'd ignored warnings and led her squadron into an obvious trap. The court-martial had been swift and merciless. Captain Rebecca Hawthorne was stripped of her rank, her wings, her identity. Only General Thomas Bradley, her former academy instructor, believed her innocence, but his transfer to European command came days before he could intervene. Kruger's network of corrupt officers buried the truth beneath mountains of manufactured evidence. Now, 8 years later, Rebecca existed in the shadows of her former life. Every rivet she inspected, every engine she serviced, was both torture and salvation, close enough to touch the machines she loved, forever barred from flying them. She'd legally changed her name, altered her appearance, and disappeared into the rank and file of maintenance personnel where her true identity remained hidden. The shipping container that served as her quarters sat in the forgotten corner of the base, tucked between a fuel depot and abandoned storage units. Inside, beneath a military-issue cot, lay a small metal box containing 3 items: a tarnished squadron badge with 4 stars, a photograph of a young captain standing beside her F-22, and a handwritten letter from Lieutenant Marcus Torres, one of the pilots who died under her command, written just hours before the mission that killed him. "Captain," the letter read in Marcus's careful handwriting, "whatever happens out there, I want you to know we trust you completely. You're the best pilot any of us have ever flown with. See you on the other side. Torres." Every morning at 4:30, Rebecca ran the base perimeter in darkness, her feet finding the same path they'd traced for 8 years. The physical pain helped drown out the emotional ache, the constant reminder of 4 lives lost and a truth buried beneath layers of corruption and lies. As she settled into her morning routine, checking aircraft systems with the mechanical precision that had kept her sane through years of exile, Rebecca had no idea that this day would be different. Change was coming to Blackstone Air Base, arriving in the form of an arrogant pilot whose casual cruelty would ignite a chain of events that would shatter her carefully constructed invisibility. The first sign came when Senior Master Sergeant Jake Williams approached her workstation. Williams was one of the few people on base who treated her as more than just another mechanic, though he had no idea why she seemed to understand aircraft systems better than technicians with twice her experience. Davis, William said, his voice carrying an edge of concern she'd rarely heard before. We've got a situation developing. The Desert Storm 3 exercise is starting next week, and we're short-staffed on the Griffin HX-9 maintenance crew. I'm putting you on the detail. Rebecca's hands stilled on the wrench she'd been turning. The Griffin HX-9 was the Air Force's newest hybrid helicopter jet, a technological marvel that could hover like a hummingbird or streak across the sky at near supersonic speeds. She'd studied every technical manual on the aircraft, memorized its specifications, understood its capabilities better than most of the pilots who flew it. "Roger that, Sergeant," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the surge of anticipation. Working on the Griffin would be the closest she'd come to real flight operations since her exile began. Williams studied her reaction with curiosity. "You seem pretty familiar with the specs already. Most techs need weeks to get comfortable with these birds." "I like to stay current on new technology," Rebecca said simply, returning to her work. "Never know when the knowledge might come in handy." What she didn't mention was that she'd spent countless off-duty hours studying the Griffin's systems, drawn to the aircraft like a moth to flame. In her dreams, she still flew, not the sluggish transport helicopters she'd been reduced to maintaining, but cutting-edge fighters and hybrid aircraft that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. As Williams walked away, Rebecca allowed herself a moment of anticipation. Desert Storm 3 would bring elite pilots from across the country to test their skills against the Griffin's capabilities. For 8 years, she'd watched from the sidelines as others flew the missions she'd once commanded. Next week, she'd be closer to the action than she'd been since her fall from grace. She had no idea that the exercise would become the stage for a confrontation that would shatter her carefully constructed invisibility and force her to choose between the safety of shadows and the dangerous light of truth. The first hook was already being set, though she wouldn't recognize it for days. Captain Derek Harrison, the exercise's flight leader, had already begun making jokes about letting the grease monkeys get a close look at real pilot work. His casual cruelty would soon escalate into something far more dangerous, a public humiliation that would backfire in ways he couldn't imagine. As Rebecca secured her tools and prepared for the long walk back to her container, she had no idea that her past was about to collide with her present in the most public way possible. The ghost in maintenance coveralls was about to discover that some truths refused to stay buried forever. The Desert Storm. 3 exercise briefing room buzzed with testosterone and competitive energy as pilots from 5 different bases gathered to review the week's training scenarios. The air was thick with the familiar mixture of jet fuel, coffee, and the particular brand of confidence that came with being among America's elite aviators. Rebecca stood in the back corner, clipboard in hand, wearing the invisible uniform of support personnel. Present but unnoticed, essential but unacknowledged. Her maintenance coveralls, faded from years of washing, marked her as clearly as any uniform could. In a room full of flight suits and polished boots, she might as well have been furniture. Captain Derek Harrison commanded the room's attention like a man born to it. Harvard-educated and politically connected, he represented everything Rebecca had once fought against in the old boys' network of military aviation. His family's influence had fast-tracked him through flight school, and his connections ensured he never faced the kind of scrutiny that could end careers. "Gentlemen," Harrison began, his voice carrying the casual arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences. "And, lady," he added with a patronizing nod toward Major Jennifer Cross, the only female pilot in the group. "This week we're going to show these Griffin birds what real pilots can do." Rebecca's jaw tightened as she listened to Harrison's dismissive comments about the maintenance crew. In his world, pilots were warriors, and everyone else was support staff, interchangeable, expendable, and barely worthy of acknowledgement. She'd encountered his type before. Officers who confused privilege with competence and mistook political connections for actual skill. Major Cross, Rebecca noticed, seemed less than impressed with Harrison's performance. The only woman among the pilots, Cross had clearly earned her position through undeniable skill rather than family connections. Her expression during Harrison's speech suggested she'd heard this particular brand of arrogance before and found it as tiresome as Rebecca did. After the briefing, Rebecca began her inspection of Griffin Alpha 7, the aircraft Harrison would be flying. The hybrid helicopter jet was a masterpiece of engineering, its twin turboshaft engines capable of producing over 4,000 horsepower each. As she ran through the pre-flight checklist, her hands moved with unconscious precision, muscle memory from thousands of hours in similar cockpits guiding her movements. The Griffin's cockpit was a symphony of advanced technology, digital displays, fly-by-wire controls, and systems integration that represented the bleeding edge of military aviation. Rebecca's fingers traced the control surfaces with professional appreciation, noting the similarities to aircraft she'd once commanded and the improvements that had been made in the years since her exile. "Excuse me, sweetheart." Harrison's voice carried the condescending tone of someone addressing a child. "I need to do my pre-flight walk-around, so if you could finish up your little inspection and get out of my way, that would be great." Rebecca looked up from the engine housing she'd been examining, her green eyes meeting his for just a moment before dropping back to her work. "Just completing the final systems check, sir. Be done in 2 minutes." "Make it 1," Harrison replied, his voice hardening. "I don't have time to wait for maintenance to play with buttons they don't understand. This is pilot work now." The words stung more than Rebecca expected. 8 years of hiding hadn't dulled the pain of being dismissed by men who couldn't match her worst day in the cockpit. She finished her inspection in silence, gathering her tools while Harrison made exaggerated gestures of impatience. As she climbed down from the aircraft, Harrison called out loudly enough for nearby pilots to hear, "Try not to break anything while I'm gone, honey. These machines are worth more than you'll make in a lifetime." Laughter rippled through the group of pilots, the easy camaraderie of those who saw themselves as superior to everyone else. Rebecca felt her face flush, but kept walking, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Senior Master Sergeant Williams witnessed the exchange from across the flight line, his expression darkening with anger. He'd worked with Rebecca for 3 years and knew she was the most competent technician on his crew. Watching Harrison's casual cruelty sparked something protective in the older NCO. "Davis," Williams called out as Rebecca stored her equipment. "Walk with me." They moved away from the aircraft, Williams choosing his words carefully. "You don't have to take that kind of treatment from anyone, captain or not. I can file a complaint about unprofessional conduct." Rebecca shook her head quickly. "It's not worth it, Sergeant. I've heard worse." "That's not the point," Williams insisted. "Harrison thinks he can treat people like dirt because Daddy's a congressman and he's got connections in the Pentagon. Somebody needs to knock him down a few pegs." As they talked, neither noticed Major Cross approaching until she spoke up. "I couldn't help but overhear. Derek's an ass, but he's also untouchable. Family money, political connections, and just enough competence to avoid getting grounded. I've been trying to put him in his place for 2 years." Williams studied Cross with interest. Despite being the only woman in the pilot group, she'd earned her position through undeniable skill and determination. Her warning about Harrison carried weight. "So what do you suggest?" Williams asked. Cross glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Harrison's got a weakness. His ego. He can't resist a challenge, especially one that makes him look good in front of an audience. The question is whether you're willing to take some risks to exploit it." Rebecca felt a chill of anticipation, though she couldn't explain why. Something about Cross's tone suggested the Major had more in mind than filing complaints through proper channels. "What kind of risks?" Williams asked. Before Cross could answer, the sound of rotor blades filled the air as Harrison's Griffin lifted off for its first training flight. The aircraft rose smoothly, transitioning from helicopter to jet mode with textbook precision. Rebecca watched with professional interest, noting the pilot's technique and finding it competent but unremarkable. "He's good," Cross admitted grudgingly. "Not great, but good enough to back up most of his trash talk. The problem is he's never been tested against real competition." Rebecca's pulse quickened despite herself. There was something in Cross's voice that suggested the Major knew more about competition than she was letting on. As Harrison's Griffin disappeared into the distance, Cross turned back to the group. "The exercise runs for 5 days. By the end of it, either Harrison learns some humility or he proves he's as good as he thinks he is. Either way, it should be interesting to watch." Williams frowned. "You're not planning anything that could get people in trouble, are you?" Cross smiled, but there was steel beneath the expression. "Sometimes, Sergeant, the best way to deal with bullies is to give them exactly what they're asking for." As the three parted ways, Rebecca felt the familiar sensation of standing at a crossroads. For 8 years, she'd chosen safety over confrontation, invisibility over vindication. But something about Harrison's casual cruelty had awakened feelings she'd thought buried forever. That evening, alone in her shipping container quarters, Rebecca opened the metal box beneath her cot and stared at the photograph of her younger self standing beside an F-22 Raptor. The woman in the picture radiated confidence and purpose, qualities that had been stripped away along with her rank and wings. She thought about Lieutenant Torres's letter, his absolute trust in her abilities, and the 4 pilots who died because of Vincent Kruger's betrayal. Their deaths had haunted her for 8 years, but Harrison's arrogance brought back another feeling she'd almost forgotten: the burning desire to prove that skill and courage mattered more than connections and politics. Rebecca closed the box and tried to sleep, but her dreams were filled with the sound of rotor blades and the memory of what it felt like to fly. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities for Harrison to demonstrate his character, and Rebecca was beginning to suspect that Major Cross had plans that went far beyond simple observation. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test everything Rebecca had learned about survival, sacrifice, and the true meaning of courage. But she had no idea that the biggest challenge wouldn't come from defending herself. It would come from deciding whether to reveal the pilot she'd once been to the world that had destroyed her. Day 3 of Desert Storm 3 brought an unexpected crisis that would change everything. Food poisoning struck 3 backup pilots simultaneously after they shared a meal at the base cantina, leaving the exercise dangerously short-staffed. Colonel Marcus Stone, the base commander whose career had been built on political maneuvering rather than leadership, saw only problems where others might see opportunity. "This is a disaster," Stone muttered during the emergency briefing. "We've got VIPs coming to observe the final demonstration, and we're 3 pilots short. The Pentagon will have my head if this exercise fails." The briefing room was tense, filled with the nervous energy of people trying to solve an impossible problem with limited resources. Rebecca sat in the back, ostensibly taking notes on maintenance schedules, but actually absorbing every detail of the operational crisis unfolding before her. Captain Harrison, fresh from another flawless training run, leaned back in his chair with a smirk that Rebecca had come to associate with trouble. His success over the past 2 days had inflated his already considerable ego, and she could see the wheels turning behind his calculating eyes. "Actually, Colonel," Harrison said, his voice carrying the tone of someone delivering a punchline, "I have a solution that might solve multiple problems at once." Major Cross, seated across the briefing room, caught Rebecca's eye with a look that said, "Here it comes." The past 2 days had seen Harrison's arrogance grow with each successful flight, his treatment of ground crew becoming increasingly dismissive and cruel. Harrison continued, his grin widening. The maintenance crew has been asking a lot of technical questions about the Griffin. Maybe it's time we gave them a real education? Show them why we maintain such strict standards for pilot certification? Colonel Stone frowned. What exactly are you suggesting, Captain? Put one of the maintenance techs in a Griffin for 5 minutes. Let them see what real pilots deal with. It'll be educational for everyone. They'll understand their place better, and we'll get some good footage for the training archives. Rebecca felt ice form in her stomach. She knew exactly where this was heading, and every instinct screamed at her to find an excuse to be somewhere else. But Senior Master Sergeant Williams had specifically assigned her to monitor this briefing, and leaving now would only draw unwanted attention. Major Cross leaned forward. That's actually not a terrible idea, Derek. Public education has value. Who did you have in mind? Harrison's smile turned predatory as his eyes swept the room and landed on Rebecca. Davis there has been asking the most questions about Griffin systems. She seems to think she understands how these birds work. Why don't we give her a front row seat? The room fell silent except for the hum of ventilation systems and the distant sound of aircraft engines. Rebecca felt every eye turn toward her, measuring, judging, already preparing for entertainment at her expense. Her pulse thundered in her ears as memories of courtrooms and humiliation flooded back. Colonel Stone studied Rebecca with the calculating look of a man weighing political risks. The liability issues alone. We'll make sure she signs every waiver in the book, Harrison interrupted. 5 minutes, standard safety protocols, engine run-up only. What could go wrong? What indeed, Rebecca thought grimly. She could think of a dozen ways this could backfire, starting with the very real possibility that muscle memory might betray her cover. 8 years of hiding had taught her self-control, but sitting in a cockpit again might awaken reflexes she'd worked hard to suppress. I don't think that's necessary, she said quietly, hoping to deflect attention. I'm perfectly comfortable with my current duties. Harrison's expression hardened. Oh, but I insist. You've been so curious about pilot procedures, Davis. This is your chance to see what you've been missing. Unless you're scared. The challenge hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Rebecca recognized the trap, refuse, and she'd be labeled a coward. Accept, and she'd be setting herself up for public humiliation. Harrison had orchestrated this perfectly, with witnesses and an audience guaranteed. Major Cross spoke up unexpectedly. Actually, this could be valuable for crew resource management training. Understanding each other's roles and challenges improves overall team effectiveness. Rebecca shot Cross a look, wondering if the Major was helping or making things worse. Cross's expression remained neutral, but something in her eyes suggested she was playing a deeper game. Colonel Stone made his decision with the air of someone eager to delegate responsibility. Fine. 5 minutes, engine run-up only, full safety protocols. Williams, make sure your tech signs every liability waiver we have. And Harrison, make sure this stays educational. As the briefing broke up, Rebecca found herself trapped in a web of her own making. Walking away now would raise questions she couldn't answer, but sitting in that cockpit might expose everything she'd worked to hide. Williams approached her with concern written across his weathered features. Davis, you don't have to do this. Harrison's being an ass, and everyone knows it. It's fine, Sergeant, Rebecca replied, though her voice betrayed none of the turmoil churning inside. 5 minutes in a cockpit won't kill me, but as she signed waiver after waiver, each document a reminder of how far she'd fallen from her former status, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that she was signing away more than legal liability. She was signing away 8 years of carefully constructed anonymity. Major Cross lingered after the others had left, pretending to review flight schedules while keeping an eye on Rebecca. When they were alone, she spoke quietly. You know, Davis, I've been watching you work on these birds for the past few days. You understand systems integration better than most pilots I know. Where did you learn so much about advanced avionics? The question was casual, but Rebecca heard the undertone of genuine curiosity. Technical manuals mostly. I like to understand what I'm working on. Cross nodded slowly. That's admirable dedication. Most maintenance folks just focus on their specific systems. You seem to see the bigger picture. There was something in Cross's tone that made Rebecca wonder if the Major suspected more than she was letting on. But before she could analyze the comment further, Harrison's voice echoed across the hangar. Davis, time for your flight lesson. Hope you don't get airsick easily. The crowd that had gathered was larger than Rebecca had expected. Word had spread through the base's informal communication networks, and dozens of personnel had found reasons to be near the flight line. Some carried phones, ready to record what they expected to be an amusing spectacle. The Griffin HX-9 sat on the tarmac like a predator at rest, its sleek lines and hybrid design representing the cutting edge of military aviation technology. Rebecca approached it with the steady gait of someone who refused to show fear, though her heart was pounding hard enough to be audible over the ambient noise. The flight suit they'd given her was a training model, deliberately ill-fitting and marked with stains that suggested it had been pulled from the bottom of a storage locker. The helmet was worse, a cracked visor and disabled communication system that would ensure she couldn't call for help if things went wrong. As Rebecca climbed into the cockpit, the familiar embrace of pilot's seat and control surfaces triggered a flood of memories so intense she had to grip the sides of the cockpit to steady herself. 8 years dissolved in an instant, and she was Captain Rebecca Hawthorne again, climbing into her F-22 before the mission that would change everything. The crowd below pressed closer, phones recording, voices rising in anticipation of entertainment. Harrison's voice cut through the noise with practiced cruelty. Remember, Davis, just sit there and try not to touch anything important. These controls are a little more complex than a wrench and socket set. Laughter from the crowd, but Rebecca barely heard it. Her eyes were scanning the instrument panel with reflexive precision, noting the differences between this cockpit and the fighters she'd once commanded, but recognizing the fundamental similarities that connected all military aircraft. Her hands hovered over the startup sequence, trembling not with fear, but with the effort of maintaining her cover. Every switch, every gauge, every control called to her with familiar comfort. The Griffin system sang to her like a favorite song, and for the first time in 8 years, Rebecca felt like she was home. Major Cross, watching from the crowd, noticed something that others missed. Davis's hands weren't shaking with nervousness. They were shaking with restraint. The way she'd moved through the pre-flight checks, the automatic adjustment of mirrors and seats, the unconscious familiarity with cockpit ergonomics, it all pointed to experience far beyond what any maintenance technician should possess. Rebecca's finger hovered over the engine start button as the crowd's mockery faded to white noise. In her chest pocket, she carried the tarnished squadron badge with 4 stars, a reminder of 4 pilots who'd trusted her with their lives and paid the ultimate price for Vincent Kruger's betrayal. The moment of truth had arrived. She could sit there passively, let Harrison have his show, and retreat back to the safety of anonymity. Or she could honor the memory of those who died by showing this crowd what real skill looked like. The choice, when it came, surprised even her. Her training and instincts had been suppressed for 8 years, but they'd never been broken. As her hand moved toward the controls, Rebecca Davis began to disappear, and Captain Rebecca Hawthorne started to emerge from the shadows. The crowd was about to get an education they'd never forget. The Griffin's engines roared to life with a precision that caught everyone off guard. What should have been a hesitant amateur startup sequence instead unfolded with surgical accuracy. Each system activated in perfect order. the twin turbo shafts spinning up to operational speed with the smoothness of absolute expertise. Captain Harrison's smirk faltered as he watched the startup procedures through the open hangar doors. 47 checks completed in 90 seconds, a process that took most pilots 3 full minutes. The crowd's anticipatory laughter died away, replaced by confused murmurs as they witnessed something that didn't match their expectations. Blackstone Tower. Rebecca's voice emerged clear and professional through the radio she'd manually activated. Griffin X-Ray 7 requesting engine start clearance. The air traffic controller, a young airman who'd only heard stories about perfect radio procedures, stammered his response. Griffin, X-Ray 7, you're not authorized for... Colonel Stone's voice cut through on the command frequency, sharp with authority and growing alarm. Who the hell authorized this? Get her out of that aircraft immediately. But Rebecca had already released the parking brake, the Griffin rolling forward with deliberate purpose. The crowd scattered as rotor wash kicked up dust and debris, their phones still recording, but their mockery silenced by the undeniable reality unfolding before them. Major Cross watched with professional fascination as the Griffin lifted off with a smoothness that spoke of absolute mastery. The aircraft rose vertically before transitioning to forward flight in one fluid motion, a maneuver that required perfect coordination of collective, cyclic, and anti-torque pedals. Jesus Christ, whispered one of the maintenance crew. She's actually flying it. Harrison's face cycled through confusion, anger, and something approaching fear. She's going to crash, he announced to anyone who would listen. Maintenance techs don't have the training for this. Someone has to stop her before she kills herself. But Rebecca had different plans. She pushed the Griffin into a vertical climb, testing its limits while the crowd below watched in stunned silence. At 5,000 feet, she executed a perfect hammerhead turn, the aircraft pivoting on its axis before diving back toward Earth. The recovery was textbook, pulling out at exactly 1,000 feet with G-forces that would have grayed out lesser pilots. The exercise parameters called for a combat search and rescue demonstration. Locate downed pilot in hostile territory, extract under fire, return to base. The current record stood at 31 minutes, held by Harrison himself from the previous year. Rebecca covered the 20 miles to the exercise area in 4 minutes, half the time of the fastest recorded approach. The simulated hostile territory lay spread below her like a deadly maze of canyons and valleys, designed to test pilot navigation and tactical skills. What followed was a masterclass in tactical aviation. She dove into the canyon system at 200 feet, using terrain masking to break simulated missile locks while maintaining speeds that turned the narrow passages into blurs. Her flight path traced impossible geometries through the air, each maneuver calculated to minimize exposure while maximizing progress toward the objective. In the control bunker, exercise directors watched their screens in disbelief. The automated defense systems, programmed to simulate enemy surface-to-air missiles, couldn't maintain locks on Rebecca's Griffin as she danced through their targeting parameters with supernatural precision. "Who the hell is flying that bird?" demanded the exercise controller, a veteran pilot himself who'd never seen maneuvering of this caliber. Colonel Stone, monitoring from the command center, felt his career flashing before his eyes. "It's a maintenance technician," he said weakly. "She's not even qualified to taxi an aircraft." The rescue beacon, typically requiring 15 to 20 minutes to locate, was found in 3 minutes. Rebecca's systematic search pattern covered maximum ground with minimum redundancy, demonstrating tactical awareness that came from real combat experience, not simulation training. The simulated extraction under fire pushed both pilot and aircraft to their limits. Hovering in a box canyon while automated systems fired simulated rounds, Rebecca made constant micro-adjustments to avoid predetermined hit zones. She completed the sequence flawlessly, her movements anticipating targeting patterns as if she'd programmed them herself. The return flight showcased pure speed. The Griffin screamed across the desert at velocities that had maintenance crews checking their instruments for malfunction. 23 minutes from takeoff to landing, 8 minutes faster than any recorded time in the exercise's history. Harrison stood frozen on the tarmac, his worldview shattered by 23 minutes of undeniable excellence. Around him, 500 people stared in absolute silence as the Griffin touched down with the gentleness of a butterfly landing on a flower, exactly centered on the pad it had departed from. As the engines wound down, Rebecca opened the canopy and climbed down with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained for 8 years. The borrowed flight suit still hung wrong, the cracked helmet tucked under her arm like an afterthought. She walked through the crowd that parted before her, heading not for glory, but toward her maintenance locker. Major Cross intercepted her halfway across the tarmac, her expression unreadable. "Davis, that was impossible. Where did you learn to fly like that?" Rebecca met her eyes steadily. "I didn't learn anything, Major. I just followed the procedures manual." Cross shook her head slowly. "I've been flying for 15 years, and I've never seen maneuvering like that. Those weren't maintenance manual procedures. That was combat experience." Before Rebecca could respond, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. A convoy of black SUVs was racing toward the flight line, emergency lights flashing, military police escorts clearing the path. Someone with serious authority was coming, and Rebecca felt a chill of recognition as she saw the 3-star flag on the lead vehicle. The convoy screeched to a halt, and General Thomas Bradley stepped out of the lead SUV. His presence commanded instant attention, backs straightening, salutes snapping into place. But his gray eyes found only one person in the crowd. "Captain," he said, his voice carrying across the silent tarmac like thunder. Rebecca stopped, turned, and for the first time in 8 years, rendered a perfect salute. "General Bradley, sir." He crossed the distance between them with measured steps, each one heavy with the weight of a decade's guilt. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the gathering. "Colonel Stone, do you know who this woman is?" Stone's response came stammered and uncertain. "She's a maintenance technician, General. Level 2 certified for—" "No." Bradley's interruption was sharp as a blade. "This is Captain Rebecca Hawthorne, the only survivor of Operation Desert Shield. The pilot who endured 72 hours of torture without breaking. The officer who eliminated 12 hostiles and rescued 2 wounded airmen while injured herself." The revelation rippled through the crowd like a physical force. Phones that had been recording humiliation now captured transformation. Rebecca stood at attention, her face betraying nothing while her world shifted beneath her feet. General Bradley continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. 8 years ago, she was betrayed by Colonel Vincent Kruger, who sold classified information to enemy forces. 4 pilots died because of his treason. Captain Hawthorne was blamed, court-martialed on falsified evidence, stripped of everything she'd earned through blood and dedication. Harrison's knees buckled, forcing him to catch himself against the Griffin's landing gear. Cross stepped backward until she hit the hangar wall, her face draining of color. The crowd stood frozen, processing the complete inversion of their worldview. "Kruger confessed before his death 3 years ago," Bradley announced. "Every charge against Captain Hawthorne was fabricated. Every piece of evidence was manufactured. Every testimony was coerced or bought. She was innocent of everything except trusting the wrong person." The general pulled an envelope from his jacket, heavy with official seals. "I carry presidential orders for the full restoration of your rank, Captain. Promotion to Major, with back pay. Command of the newest Griffin Squadron, your choice of posting." The silence stretched, broken only by the distant sound of jet engines on patrol. every eye fixed on Rebecca, waiting for her response to this reversal of fortune that had come 8 years too late. But Rebecca had learned something during her time in the shadows, something about the difference between vindication and peace, between getting what you deserve and knowing what you're worth. Her answer would surprise everyone, including herself. The ghost in maintenance coveralls was about to teach them all one final lesson about the true meaning of victory: the power of walking away. Rebecca looked at the envelope in General Bradley's outstretched hand for a long moment, her green eyes reflecting the afternoon sun. The crowd pressed closer, phones recording every second of what they sensed was a pivotal moment. This was the vindication she'd dreamed about for 8 years. Complete restoration, promotion, command of her own squadron. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the quiet strength of someone who'd found peace in the deepest valleys of defeat. "Thank you, General, but I don't need that anymore." The refusal sent shocked murmurs through the crowd. She stepped forward, removing the borrowed flight suit to reveal her faded maintenance coveralls beneath. With careful precision, she folded the suit and handed it to Harrison, who remained on his knees beside the aircraft. "Keep this, Captain," she said quietly. "You'll need it more than I will." Harrison's face was chalk white, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. He stammered something unintelligible, unable to meet her eyes. Rebecca turned to face the still streaming cameras and spoke directly to the invisible audience. "Skill doesn't care about gender, rank, or social status. Neither does truth. But character." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "Character reveals itself in how we treat those we believe have no power to fight back." General Bradley tried once more. "Rebecca, please. The Air Force needs pilots like you. The Griffin program needs your expertise. Let us make this right." She smiled, the expression transforming her weathered features. "You already have, General. You told the truth. That's all I ever wanted." Major Cross pushed through the crowd, her professional composure cracking. "Captain Hawthorne, you can't just walk away from this. You've been vindicated. You could have any command you want, write your own ticket, after what they did to you." "What they did to me was 8 years ago," Rebecca replied calmly. "What I choose to do now defines who I am today. I've learned to measure success differently." The crowd parted as she walked toward her quarters, dignity radiating from every step. Behind her, the base's entire power structure was beginning to crumble. Colonel Stone was already on his phone with Pentagon officials, trying to explain how a disgraced pilot had been hiding in plain sight on his base for 8 years. Harrison sat in the dust beside the Griffin, his career effectively over. The video of his humiliation was already going viral across social media platforms. But Rebecca knew none of this. She was focused on the simple act of packing her few possessions, preparing for whatever horizon called to her next. As she folded her spare coveralls, Senior Master Sergeant Williams knocked on her container door. His face showed a mixture of awe and regret. "Captain," he began, then caught himself. "Rebecca, I'm sorry. If I'd known who you were—" "You treated me with respect when you thought I was just another mechanic," she replied. "That says more about your character than any revelation about mine." Williams studied her with the shrewd eyes of a career NCO who'd seen every kind of officer the military produced. "You're really walking away from all this? The promotion, the command, the chance to clear your name officially?" Rebecca considered the question while she placed her few books in a cardboard box. "My name was never really sullied, Sergeant. The people who mattered, the pilots who flew with me, the ground crews who trusted me, the families who knew the truth, they never doubted my integrity. Official vindication is just paperwork." As she prepared to leave, Rebecca made one final gesture that would become legend among the maintenance crews of Blackstone Air Base. She left 3 items on the small desk: the tarnished squadron badge with 4 stars, now polished bright by years of handling; the photograph of her younger self beside the F-22, no longer hidden in shame but standing proud in a simple frame; and a new letter, written in steady handwriting on fresh paper. "For the next woman who faces impossible odds," it read, "your worth isn't determined by their recognition. Fly your own course." RH. Outside, the sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across Blackstone Air Base. Amanda Rodriguez, a 23-year-old maintenance trainee who'd watched everything from the hangar entrance, found the courage to enter the abandoned container. Her hands shook as she picked up the badge, feeling its weight, understanding its significance. Through the window, she watched Rebecca's pickup truck disappear down the access road, heading toward whatever horizon called to her next. The live stream had ended, but its impact was already rippling outward. Within hours, the video would have millions of views, sparking conversations about prejudice, redemption, and the quiet strength of walking away from battles already won. The aftermath of Rebecca's demonstration hit Blackstone Air Base like a Category 5 hurricane. Within 24 hours, the viral video had been viewed over 3 million times across multiple platforms, with comments flooding in from current and former military personnel, aviation enthusiasts, and people who simply recognized injustice when they saw it. Captain Derek Harrison's political connections, which had once seemed unshakable, crumbled like a house of cards in a windstorm. The video clearly showed his arrogance and cruelty, his assumption that maintenance personnel were beneath consideration. By noon the following day, his family's congressional allies were distancing themselves from the scandal, and Harrison himself was summoned to an emergency meeting with General Bradley. "Explain to me," Bradley said, his voice carrying the chill of a Montana winter, "how a decorated combat veteran was working maintenance on my aircraft for 8 years, while officers under my command treated her like dirt." Harrison's usual swagger had evaporated completely. "Sir, I had no idea she was a former pilot. The records showed exactly what they were supposed to show," Bradley interrupted. "Captain Hawthorne changed her identity legally to protect herself from further persecution. But that doesn't excuse your behavior towards someone you believed was just a maintenance technician." Colonel Stone, summoned to the same meeting, looked like a man facing his own execution. His career had been built on political maneuvering rather than leadership, and the viral video had exposed every weakness in his command structure. "Sir," Stone began weakly, "we had no protocols in place for treating people with basic human dignity?" Bradley's question cut through Stone's excuses like a sword. "The way your officers treated Hawthorne, excuse me, Davis, is the way they treat everyone they consider beneath them. That's a command climate problem, Colonel. Your command climate problem." Major Jennifer Cross, also present at the meeting, had remained silent throughout the confrontation. Unlike Harrison and Stone, she was analyzing the situation with the tactical awareness that had made her an effective pilot. She understood that this scandal would reshape careers and reputations across the entire Air Force. "General," she said carefully, "what can we do to make this right? Beyond the official vindication, I mean." Bradley studied her with approval. "That's the right question, Major. Captain Hawthorne chose to walk away from reinstatement, but the Air Force still owes her, and everyone like her, real change. The ripple effects were already beginning. Within 48 hours of the video's release, the Air Force Chief of Staff had ordered a service-wide review of command climate and treatment of enlisted personnel. The hashtag number #FlyYourOwnCourse was trending on social media, with thousands of people sharing their own stories of workplace discrimination and resilience. Meanwhile, investigative journalists were digging into the original court-martial that had destroyed Rebecca's career. Vincent Kruger's confession, buried in classified files for 3 years, was slowly being declassified under pressure from congressional oversight committees. Harrison's resignation came on Thursday morning, delivered in a brief typed statement that admitted no wrongdoing but cited personal reasons for his departure from military service. His family's political machine worked overtime to spin the story, but public opinion had already turned decisively against him. Colonel Stone's fate was sealed when the Pentagon investigation uncovered a pattern of discrimination complaints that had been buried or ignored during his tenure at Blackstone. His removal came with a recommendation for court-martial on charges of conduct unbecoming an officer. But perhaps the most significant change came from an unexpected source. General Bradley, haunted by his failure to protect Rebecca 8 years earlier, announced the establishment of the Hawthorne Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting military personnel who faced retaliation for reporting misconduct. Too many good people have been destroyed by systems that protect the powerful at the expense of the righteous, Bradley announced at a press conference. The Hawthorne Foundation will ensure that no one faces what Captain Hawthorne endured alone. The congressional hearing convened 2 weeks after the viral video shocked the nation. Committee Chairwoman Senator Patricia Williams gavelled the session to order, her stern expression reflecting the gravity of the situation. The hearing room was packed with media, military personnel, and members of the public who had followed Rebecca's story with growing outrage. This committee, Senator Williams announced, has been tasked with investigating systemic failures in military justice that allowed a decorated combat veteran to be falsely accused, stripped of rank, and forced into exile for 8 years while the real traitor walked free. General Bradley was the first witness called, his dress uniform bearing ribbons from 3 decades of service. His testimony was devastating in its precision, methodically documenting how Vincent Kruger's network of corrupt officers had manufactured evidence and suppressed investigations. Kruger didn't act alone, Bradley testified, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed hearing room. He had accomplices at multiple levels of command, officers who traded integrity for advancement, who sold their souls for career security. The committee had obtained Kruger's full confession, delivered on his deathbed 3 years earlier. The document, finally declassified under congressional pressure, revealed the scope of his betrayal. Intelligence sold to enemy forces, mission plans leaked to hostile governments, a web of corruption that had cost American lives for over a decade. Captain Hawthorne was chosen as a scapegoat, Bradley continued, because she was competent enough to be believable as a reckless commander, but isolated enough to be destroyed without significant resistance. She was a woman in a man's profession, an outsider who lacked the political connections to fight back effectively. Representative James Morrison, the committee's ranking member, leaned forward with barely contained anger. "General, are you telling this committee that an innocent officer was deliberately framed to protect a traitor? That is exactly what I'm telling you, Congressman. And the officers who participated in that frame-up are still serving in positions of authority throughout the Air Force." The hearing's second day brought testimony from pilots who had served with Rebecca before her fall. Lieutenant Colonel David Kim, one of the few survivors from her original squadron, provided devastating testimony about her competence and character. "Captain Hawthorne was the best pilot I ever flew with," Kim testified, his voice thick with emotion. "She saved my life twice in combat situations, made decisions under pressure that lesser pilots couldn't even comprehend. The idea that she would recklessly endanger her squadron is not just wrong, it's impossible." Master Sergeant Williams, Rebecca's former supervisor at Blackstone, testified about her years in maintenance, describing a woman of extraordinary competence who had endured daily humiliation with quiet dignity. She knew those aircraft better than the pilots who flew them, Williams said. She could diagnose problems by sound alone, understand complex systems that stumped engineers with advanced degrees. We called her the professor, but now I understand why. She wasn't learning, she was remembering. The hearing's most dramatic moment came when Derek Harrison was called to testify. Stripped of his commission and facing potential criminal charges, he appeared broken, his earlier arrogance replaced by the hollow-eyed look of someone whose world had collapsed. Under aggressive questioning from Senator Williams, Harrison admitted to years of discriminatory behavior, not just toward Rebecca, but toward enlisted personnel throughout his career. You treated people you considered beneath you with systematic cruelty, Senator Williams observed coldly. And when someone demonstrated skills that surpassed your own, your response was to humiliate them publicly. Harrison's voice was barely audible. I was wrong. I was taught that maintaining distance from enlisted personnel was necessary for leadership. I took that too far. You took it to the point of deliberate cruelty, the senator corrected. The video evidence shows you delighted in humiliating someone you believed was powerless to fight back. The committee's final witness was unexpected. Rebecca herself, appearing via video link from an undisclosed location. She had agreed to testify only after General Bradley's personal plea, and her appearance sent a ripple of anticipation through the hearing room. Captain Hawthorne, Senator Williams began, you have endured 8 years of exile for crimes you did not commit. In your own words, tell this committee how this injustice affected you. Rebecca appeared composed, her voice steady as she spoke. Senator, the false accusations and court-martial were devastating, but not for the reasons people might expect. The loss of rank and wings was painful, but the deeper wound was the loss of trust in the institution I had devoted my life to serving. She paused, choosing her words carefully. 8 years ago, I believed that competence and integrity would always be rewarded, that truth would prevail over politics. Learning that officers I trusted could sacrifice honor for advancement was more damaging than any physical torture I endured in captivity. Representative Morrison asked the question that everyone was thinking. Captain, General Bradley has testified that the Air Force is prepared to restore your rank, provide back pay, and offer you command of any unit you choose. Will you accept these offers? Rebecca's smile was sad but peaceful. Congressman, I appreciate the gesture, but I've learned to measure success differently. I don't need official validation to know my worth. The real victory isn't in my reinstatement. It's in ensuring this never happens to anyone else. Her testimony continued for 2 hours, Rebecca answering questions with the precision of someone who had spent 8 years analyzing every aspect of her downfall. She spoke about systemic problems in military culture, about the importance of protecting whistleblowers, about the need for genuine accountability at all levels of command. When the hearing concluded, Senator Williams announced that the committee would recommend sweeping reforms to military justice procedures, including independent oversight of court-martial proceedings and stronger protections for personnel reporting misconduct. But the most significant outcome was something that couldn't be legislated: a fundamental shift in how the military viewed integrity, competence, and the treatment of those without political power. 6 months after the hearing, Rebecca stood on a wind-swept plateau in Montana, watching the sun rise over the Rocky Mountains. The small airfield below her was busy with morning activity: student pilots preparing for lessons, mechanics performing pre-flight inspections, instructors reviewing flight plans with nervous beginners. The Hawthorne Aviation Academy had grown beyond her wildest expectations. What had started as a simple flight school for military veterans had evolved into something much larger, a place where competence mattered more than connections, where skill was valued over politics, where people who had been written off by others could discover their true potential. Rebecca's phone buzzed with a text from Amanda Rodriguez, the young woman who had found her letter at Blackstone. Amanda was now the Academy's chief maintenance instructor, having parlayed her experience at Blackstone into a position where she could teach others that technical expertise deserved the same respect as any other skill. Graduation ceremony this afternoon, the text read. 23 new pilots, including 5 who were told they weren't pilot material by traditional programs. You should be proud. Rebecca smiled as she pocketed the phone. The Academy's success wasn't measured in profit margins or political influence, but in the quiet satisfaction of watching people exceed others' expectations of them. Former enlisted personnel who had been dismissed as just mechanics were now flying commercial aircraft. Women who had been told they lacked the right stuff were breaking barriers in aviation careers. The Academy had become a magnet for people who didn't fit traditional molds. Veterans struggling with PTSD found purpose in teaching flight safety. Former military officers who had been forced out for reporting misconduct discovered new careers in aviation instruction. Rebecca had created something that the traditional military couldn't: a true meritocracy. General Bradley visited regularly, using his influence to direct qualified candidates toward the Academy and helping to secure contracts for pilot training programs. The foundation he had established in Rebecca's honor had grown into a powerful force for military justice reform, with offices in 12 cities and a legal staff dedicated to protecting whistleblowers. The viral video from Blackstone had faded from social media prominence, but its impact continued to reverberate through military culture. The hashtag #FlyYourOwnCourse had become a rallying cry for people facing discrimination or injustice, a reminder that true victory sometimes meant walking away from systems designed to diminish you. Derek Harrison had been court-martialed and dishonorably discharged, his family's political connections finally exhausted by the weight of public outrage. He now worked at a car dealership in Ohio, his military career a cautionary tale told in leadership seminars across the armed forces. Colonel Stone had faced similar justice, stripped of rank and pension for his role in enabling discriminatory command climates. The Pentagon had used his case as an example of how not to lead, implementing new training programs focused on inclusive leadership and ethical decision-making. But for Rebecca, the most meaningful changes were personal. She had learned to forgive, not because the people who wronged her deserved it, but because carrying anger was too heavy a burden for someone trying to fly. As she prepared for the day's first flight lesson, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought her here. 8 years of exile had taught her that identity couldn't be stripped away by others, that competence spoke louder than rank, that integrity was its own reward. The student pilot arriving for his lesson was a former Army mechanic named Carlos Martinez, told by 3 different flight schools that he lacked the aptitude for aviation. Rebecca had reviewed his application personally, recognizing something familiar in his story: the quiet determination of someone who refused to accept others' limitations. "Ready for your solo flight, Carlos?" she asked as they walked toward the training aircraft. His grin was infectious. "Ma'am, I've been ready for this my whole life. Just took a while to find the right place to prove it." As they climbed into the cockpit, Rebecca felt the familiar peace that came with being exactly where she belonged. The instrument panel before them wasn't the cutting-edge technology of the Griffin HX-9, but it represented something more valuable: opportunity without prejudice, advancement based on merit, respect earned through competence rather than connections. "Remember," she told Carlos as he went through his pre-flight checklist, "flying isn't about impressing anyone else. It's about understanding that the sky doesn't care about your background, your gender, or your social status. It only cares about your skill and your courage." The engine roared to life, and Carlos's hands moved over the controls with growing confidence. Rebecca watched with the satisfaction of a teacher seeing potential become reality, remembering her own first solo flight decades earlier. As the aircraft lifted off the runway, climbing toward the endless Montana sky, Rebecca understood that she had found something more valuable than vindication or revenge. She had found purpose, peace, and the freedom that comes from defining success on your own terms. The ghost in maintenance coveralls was gone forever, replaced by someone who had learned that true flight meant more than just leaving the ground. It meant soaring above the limitations others tried to impose, navigating by the stars of your own integrity, and landing safely in the knowledge that competence, courage, and character were the only rankings that truly mattered. Below them, the Rocky Mountains stretched toward distant horizons, beautiful and challenging and full of infinite possibilities. Rebecca had taught Carlos to fly, but in doing so, she had reminded herself of the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the greatest victory is not in conquering your enemies, but in refusing to become them. The sky, as always, was waiting for those brave enough to claim it. 2 years after leaving Blackstone Air Base, Rebecca received an unexpected invitation. The Air Force was dedicating a new training facility, and General Bradley had specifically requested her presence at the ceremony. The invitation sat on her desk for a week before she made her decision. The Integrity Center at Blackstone Air Base was everything the old training programs had not been. Built with input from the Hawthorne Foundation, it emphasized character development alongside technical skills, leadership through service rather than domination, and the fundamental principle that respect was earned through competence, not rank. Rebecca arrived quietly, wearing civilian clothes and dark sunglasses, hoping to observe from the back of the crowd. But General Bradley spotted her immediately and made his way through the gathering. "Captain," he said, using the rank she'd never officially reclaimed. "Thank you for coming. This wouldn't exist without you." The ceremony was everything Rebecca had hoped the military could become. Instructors spoke about inclusive leadership, about recognizing talent wherever it emerged, about the importance of character over connections. Student pilots included men and women from diverse backgrounds, united not by privilege, but by their shared commitment to excellence. Major Jennifer Cross, now the facility's commanding officer, delivered the keynote address. Her words carried the weight of someone who had witnessed transformation firsthand. "This facility exists because one person had the courage to stand for principle over politics," Cross said, her eyes finding Rebecca in the crowd. "She taught us that true strength isn't about dominating others. It's about lifting them up. She showed us that the highest honor isn't in being recognized by others, but in recognizing the worth in ourselves." During the reception that followed, Rebecca was approached by a young woman in a crisp flight suit. Lieutenant Sarah Williams introduced herself as one of the center's first graduates. "Ma'am," Williams said, her voice filled with emotion, "I wanted to thank you. I was told by 3 different instructors that I didn't have what it takes to be a pilot. But Major Cross showed me your video, told me your story. It gave me the courage to keep trying." Rebecca studied the young woman's face, seeing something familiar in her determination. "What did you learn here that was different?" Williams smiled. "That being a pilot isn't about proving you're better than anyone else. It's about proving you can be trusted with the responsibility. And that earning that trust starts with how you treat the people who help you succeed." As the evening wound down, Rebecca found herself alone with General Bradley in his office. The walls were covered with photographs from his long career, but prominently displayed was a framed picture from the day Rebecca had demonstrated the Griffin's capabilities. "I need to ask you something," Bradley said, his voice carrying the weight of years. "Do you ever regret walking away? You could have had any command in the Air Force. You could have been chief of staff by now. Rebecca considered the question while gazing at the photo. In it, she stood beside the Griffin, still wearing maintenance coveralls, but her expression showed the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was. "General," she said finally, "I spent 8 years learning something that most people never understand. Success isn't about reaching the top of someone else's ladder. It's about building your own ladder and helping others climb it too." Bradley nodded slowly. "The Foundation has helped over 300 military personnel report misconduct without retaliation. The Academy has graduated 250 pilots who couldn't find opportunities elsewhere. That's quite a legacy." "It's not about legacy," Rebecca replied. "It's about making sure that no one else has to choose between integrity and survival. The military is stronger when it embraces everyone who can contribute, not just those who fit a predetermined mold." As Rebecca prepared to leave, Bradley handed her a small package. "This belonged to Lieutenant Torres. His family wanted you to have it." Inside was Marcus Torres's flight wings, polished bright and mounted in a simple frame. A note from his mother was included. "Captain Hawthorne, Marcus wrote about you in every letter. He said you taught him that being a pilot meant being responsible for everyone who trusted you to get them home safely. Thank you for keeping that promise in the way that mattered most." Rebecca felt tears she'd held back for years finally beginning to fall. For the first time since the fateful mission that had changed everything, she allowed herself to grieve properly, not just for the 4 pilots who had died, but for the young woman she had been, full of idealism and trust in the system she served. The drive back to Montana took her through small towns and vast landscapes, past farms and ranches where ordinary people lived extraordinary lives far from the corridors of power. These were the people the military was meant to protect, Rebecca realized, not the politicians and generals who often seemed more concerned with their own advancement than with the principles they claimed to defend. She stopped at a small diner in Wyoming, where a waitress named Betty served her coffee and asked about the flight suit hanging in her truck. "Are you a pilot?" Betty asked with genuine curiosity. "Sometimes," Rebecca replied with a smile. "Must be exciting, flying those big military planes." Rebecca thought about the question while stirring her coffee. "The flying is the easy part. The hard part is remembering why you do it and who you're doing it for." Betty nodded as if she understood perfectly. "My husband was in the Army. He used to say the same thing about being a soldier. It wasn't about the fighting, it was about protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves." That night, alone in a roadside motel, Rebecca called Amanda Rodriguez. The young woman was now running her own maintenance training program, teaching other women that technical expertise was just as valuable as any other skill. "How are the new students?" Rebecca asked. "Incredible," Amanda replied. "We have women from all over the country coming here because they heard about what happened at Blackstone. They want to learn from people who understand that competence doesn't depend on what you look like or where you come from." "And the resistance?" Amanda laughed. "There's always resistance to change. But you taught us something important. You don't fight resistance by becoming bitter. You fight it by being so good at what you do that people have to notice." Rebecca smiled. "That's not what I taught you. That's what you learned." When she arrived back at the academy the next morning, Rebecca found a surprise waiting for her. Carlos Martinez, her former student, had returned from his first commercial flying assignment with news that would change everything. "Rebecca," he said, his excitement barely contained, "I've been talking to airlines about pilot shortages. They're interested in what we're doing here, not just the training, but the philosophy. The idea that good pilots come from all backgrounds if you give them the right opportunity." The proposal he outlined was ambitious, a partnership between the academy and major airlines to create a new pathway for aspiring pilots. Instead of requiring expensive private flight training or military experience, the program would identify candidates based on aptitude and character, then provide comprehensive training that emphasized both technical skills and ethical leadership. We could train 500 pilots a year, Carlos explained. People who never thought they could afford flight school, veterans who don't fit traditional military molds, women and minorities who've been overlooked by conventional programs. Rebecca listened with growing excitement. This was exactly the kind of systemic change she'd hoped to inspire. Not just training better pilots, but changing how the aviation industry thought about who could become a pilot. The partnership launched 6 months later with great fanfare. Airlines that had struggled to find qualified pilots suddenly had access to a pool of candidates who brought diverse perspectives and strong ethical foundations to their cockpits. The program's success rate exceeded all expectations, with graduates consistently outperforming pilots from traditional programs in both technical evaluations and customer service ratings. Rebecca found herself traveling the country, speaking at aviation conferences and military academies about the importance of inclusive leadership and merit-based advancement. Her message was always the same: competence has no gender, no race, no social class. It emerges wherever people are given genuine opportunities to succeed. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came during a routine training flight with a new student. Maria Santos was a single mother from Texas who had worked as an aircraft mechanic for 10 years before deciding to pursue her dream of becoming a pilot. Traditional flight schools had told her she was too old, too set in her ways, too focused on her children to commit to the demanding training schedule. As they practiced emergency procedures over the Montana mountains, Maria executed a perfect engine-out landing that would have impressed seasoned instructors. When they climbed out of the aircraft, she turned to Rebecca with tears in her eyes. "I never thought this would be possible," Maria said. "Everyone told me I was crazy to try." Rebecca put a hand on her shoulder. "Maria, the only opinion that matters is your own. If you know you can do something, don't let anyone else convince you otherwise." "But what if I fail?" "Then you fail trying to achieve something meaningful. That's better than succeeding at something that doesn't matter to you." As Maria walked away to prepare for her next lesson, Rebecca realized that this was what true victory looked like. Not the dramatic moment of vindication, but the quiet satisfaction of watching someone else discover their potential. The academy continued to grow, expanding to multiple locations and training thousands of pilots who might never have had the opportunity otherwise. The Hawthorne Foundation evolved into a broader organization supporting workplace justice and inclusive leadership across multiple industries. Rebecca remained involved in both organizations, but her role shifted from leader to mentor, from focal point to facilitator. She had learned that the most lasting changes came not from individual heroics, but from building systems that empowered others to succeed. On quiet evenings, she would sometimes pull out the photograph of her younger self, standing beside the F-22 Raptor. The woman in the picture seemed like a stranger now, so certain of her place in the world, so trusting in institutional justice, so focused on external validation. The woman Rebecca had become was different, more patient, more strategic, more focused on lasting impact than immediate recognition. She had learned that true leadership wasn't about commanding from the front, but about creating conditions where others could lead themselves. 5 years after the Blackstone incident, Rebecca received a letter that would profoundly impact the final chapter of her story. It came from Lieutenant Colonel David Kim, her former squadron mate who had testified at the congressional hearing. "Rebecca," the letter began, "I'm writing to you from Afghanistan, where I'm currently commanding a joint aviation unit. Yesterday, something happened that I knew you'd want to hear about. We were conducting a rescue mission, similar to the ones we used to fly together. The conditions were terrible: sandstorm, enemy fire, wounded soldiers who needed immediate evacuation. My pilots were good, but the situation was beyond their experience level. I found myself asking what Captain Rebecca Hawthorne would do, not just the tactical decisions, but the leadership approach. How would she balance the risks? How would she inspire confidence while acknowledging danger? But perhaps the most significant change was harder to quantify: a shift in how military personnel treated each other, particularly those in support roles. The maintenance crews, logistics specialists, and administrative personnel who made operations possible were being recognized as essential partners rather than invisible servants. Rebecca shared the letter with her staff at the academy during their weekly meeting. The organization had grown to include 3 campuses, over 50 instructors, and partnerships with major airlines and aircraft manufacturers. But its core mission remained unchanged, proving that competence knew no boundaries. "This is why we do what we do," Rebecca told the assembled group. "Not for recognition or profit, but because every person we train has the potential to influence hundreds of others. The pilot who treats ground crew with respect creates a culture of respect. The mechanic who takes pride in their work inspires others to excellence. The instructor who sees potential in unlikely candidates changes entire lives." Dr. Sarah Chen, the Academy's Director of Academic Affairs, raised her hand. A former military psychologist who had studied the impact of leadership styles on unit effectiveness, she brought scientific rigor to the Academy's teaching methods. "Rebecca, we've been tracking our graduates for 3 years now," Dr. Chen said. "The data is remarkable. Our pilots have significantly lower incident rates, higher job satisfaction scores, and better peer evaluations than industry averages. More importantly, they're becoming leaders themselves, creating positive work environments wherever they go." The Academy had become a case study for business schools and military colleges, demonstrating that inclusive practices weren't just morally right, but practically effective. Companies that hired the Academy's graduates reported higher employee retention, better team cohesion, and improved performance metrics across all measures. But Rebecca's proudest achievement wasn't measured in statistics. It was visible in the faces of students like Marcus Johnson, a former homeless veteran who had discovered a talent for aviation maintenance; Jennifer Walsh, a teenager from rural Montana who had dreamed of flying since childhood but couldn't afford traditional flight training; and Robert Chen, a disabled veteran who had developed innovative adaptive technologies that allowed pilots with physical limitations to fly safely. Each success story represented someone who might have been overlooked or dismissed by conventional programs. Each graduate went on to influence others, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond aviation. The Academy's most challenging test came during its 5th year, when a tragic accident at another flight school raised questions about training standards across the industry. Federal investigators scrutinized every aspect of the Academy's operations, looking for shortcuts or compromises that might have contributed to lower costs. Instead, they found something unprecedented: a training program that exceeded government safety standards while maintaining costs through efficiency and innovation rather than corner cutting. The Academy's emphasis on character development had created a culture where students and instructors looked out for each other's safety, where admitting uncertainty was seen as strength rather than weakness, where learning from mistakes was encouraged rather than punished. The investigation's final report became a model for aviation safety programs nationwide. Its core finding was simple but profound. Organizations that prioritized human development alongside technical training achieved better outcomes in every measurable category. Rebecca was invited to speak at the announcement of the report's findings. Standing before an audience of government officials, industry leaders, and aviation professionals, she felt the weight of everything that had brought her to this moment. 5 years ago, she began, I was invisible, a maintenance worker whose expertise was ignored, whose value was dismissed, whose identity was hidden. I thought my career was over, my contribution finished. What I didn't understand then was that endings can be beginnings. Failure can be preparation. Being overlooked can be an opportunity to see things differently. The Academy didn't succeed because we lowered standards or took shortcuts. We succeeded because we raised the bar, not just for technical competence, but for character, integrity, and mutual respect. We proved that when you invest in the whole person, you get better pilots, better mechanics, better leaders. She paused, looking out at faces that included former students, current instructors, industry partners, and government officials who had once dismissed her as irrelevant. Today, our graduates are flying commercial aircraft, maintaining military jets, teaching the next generation of aviators, and leading their own organizations. They carry with them not just technical skills, but the understanding that true excellence comes from lifting others up, not putting them down. That's not my legacy. It's our legacy. It belongs to everyone who chose to see potential instead of limitations, who invested in people others had written off, who proved that competence has no gender, no race, no social class. The sky has always been waiting for those brave enough to claim it. Our job is to make sure everyone gets a chance to try. The applause that followed lasted for several minutes, but Rebecca was already thinking about the future. The Academy was planning to expand internationally, bringing its inclusive training methods to countries where aviation opportunities were even more limited. The Hawthorne Foundation was developing new programs to support workplace justice in industries beyond aviation. But perhaps most importantly, a new generation of leaders was emerging. People who had learned that true strength came from empowering others, that lasting success required lifting everyone up, that the measure of a leader wasn't how high they climbed, but how many people they helped climb with them. As Rebecca drove home through the Montana mountains that evening, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. The young captain who had believed so completely in the system's fairness seemed like a character from someone else's story. The woman who had endured 8 years of exile and humiliation felt like a necessary but painful chapter. The person she had become, teacher, mentor, builder of opportunities for others, felt like the truest version of herself she had ever been. Her phone buzzed with a text from Amanda Rodriguez, now running maintenance training programs across 3 states. Rebecca, just wanted you to know, we had a young woman apply today who said she heard about our program from a pilot who graduated from your academy. She said he told her that competence was the only qualification that mattered. The ripples keep spreading. Rebecca smiled as she read the message. This was how real change happened, not through dramatic moments or grand gestures, but through countless small acts of recognition, respect, and opportunity. Each person who was given a chance passed that chance on to others. Each instance of fairness created expectations of more fairness. Each leader who prioritized character over connections raised the standard for everyone. The ghost in maintenance coveralls was truly gone now, replaced by someone who understood that the greatest victory wasn't in proving your worth to those who doubted you. It was in creating a world where no one had to prove their worth in the first place. As she pulled into her driveway, Rebecca could see lights on in the Academy's dormitories across the valley. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, new opportunities to transform lives and change an industry. The sky, as always, was waiting for those brave enough to claim it. But now, thanks to the work of many hands and hearts, more people than ever before would get their chance to fly. In the end, that was enough. That was everything. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most, and where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below. I remembered something you told us years ago. Take care of your people, and your people will take care of the mission. So instead of just giving orders, I talked through the situation with my pilots, listened to their concerns, incorporated their insights into the plan. The mission was successful. We brought everyone home. But more importantly, my pilots performed beyond what they thought possible because they felt trusted and valued. That's your legacy, Rebecca. Not just in how you flew, but in how you led. The letter continued for several pages, describing changes in military culture that could be traced back to the reforms inspired by Rebecca's story. Young officers were being taught that leadership meant service, not domination. Flight training programs were emphasizing character development alongside technical skills. The old boys network that had once dominated military aviation was slowly giving way to true meritocracy.